Doo-doo-doo. Welcome to the stream, which is up and running. Look at that.
Oh boy, we're back. We're back and we're streaming. It hadn't started for me, so if you saw me staring just like super intensely at my screen for a second there, it was because I was vexedly trying to make sure that we were actually live. But we are live. So hi everybody. Welcome to the very second story streams. Or StorySights. It's a stream. You know, it's Friday. Whatever. So happy to have you all here. I'm here once again with Nick. And if this is your very first time joining us for StorySights, welcome. If you're back for more, that's awesome. Thanks for coming by. The way this works is we have people submit questions in advance, and we take down a bunch of those, and we're basically going to handle one of those an episode just to kick things off. It'll be kind of our theme for the day, and then we will be answering questions from the chat and just generally talking with y'all. The other thing, of course, we do is story sprints. So you'll notice that there's a timer on our screen. I'm just going to point in all directions because it's somewhere nearby. That is a sprint timer. So if you'd like to get some writing done while we jabber away about various story issues, please do. The timer runs for 15 minutes, and we'll take a 5-minute brain break, and then another 15 minutes. So we should have 3 of those over the course of our session here today.
Yep.
Please throw your word counts into the chat. Love seeing people make some progress. Remember, any words you've written is good progress. And without further ado, I think we'll kick things off. Nick, how are you doing today?
I will set the timer for you. So there we go. I've reset the timer to 15. People can start writing. Me, I'm doing okay. I mean, I moved from my side camera angle to my upper camera angle.
Fancy.
Which now includes a free cat. So everyone gets that as the benefit. Who will probably not do anything. Yep.
Yeah, but will still exist and be a cat, which is a delight in and of itself. So
yeah, so
I'd say
if that's what people need to inspire them. And I've rearranged the stream as I continue to mess around. I tried to class the whole stream up a little bit. The stream should be going faster. We only have about 10-second delay now, so that's nice. So we can see everyone within like 10 seconds, which will help because we are trying to be more interactive this time. Last time we had our introduction, but this time we really just have that one topic, and then as people ask questions in the chat, we just go with what people are asking. So I say this to all of you in chat. Nope, there we go, over here. Stupid mirroring. All of chat over here. Whoop. You are welcome to submit your questions on the topic, which I will now reveal with our fancy font. I don't know if you haven't seen this, Tom, but so classy.
I actually can't see the stream. I'm just seeing our video calls. So I'll just imagine the best possible. Oh, what a font!
It's not that fancy.
World of fonts! Yeah. My, oh my. I have literally never seen such a thing.
We've oversold the font. Yes, I scrolled through the many font options that I had, and I picked this classy one to tell everyone about today's subject, which you told me was going to be the subject of today, Tom. What is today's subject?
Today's subject is writer's block. Oh no! Truly the worst thing. It sucks. We all know it sucks. You've probably experienced it before. If you haven't, you're probably worried about experiencing it. And it is one of the great fears of all writers, and one we get questions about all the time. So I figured since we're just starting out, it might be worth kicking things off with a question that an issue that comes for all of us in our time writing. Nick, how's it looking, that font? Paint a word picture for me.
It's like that curvy scripture of a scroll.
Oh, you know? Yeah.
That's what I got for us. Yeah.
That's great.
If I could have gotten the S in that full ridiculous piece of art, I would have, but apparently it doesn't come that way. This is just how the font set it gives me. But I wasn't blocked when it came to writing out that question. I just wrote subject, writer's block, and that was it. It was pretty easy. So
excellent. Well, let's talk a little bit about how you can solve for writer's block if you don't just get to write subject writer's block, which you could do. That could just be your story. It's very short and it really gets to the point. But writer's block is a big issue, and more importantly, it's a scary issue because it is one of the problems that writers encounter that seemingly has no answer.
Yes.
Which can really, really throw you off. There's nothing worse when you're in like a good writing flow, things are working really well for you, and then just suddenly your brain just runs out of gas. It's a terrible feeling. It's it's really disruptive. But the good news is there are some tactics you can use to try and get your brain unstuck. So that's kind of what we're going to start with today. And then, as Nick said, aiming to be nice and interactive today. So please, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat, or any thoughts or experiences you want to share, anything of that sort, feel free. Also, if you're just too busy writing because of our writing sprints, that's totally fine too. We have some backup questions if we run out of stuff to talk about. So no worries, no stress. We're just here to
always
talk
writing
about
with
exactly
with writer's block. I don't think we'll be blocked on talking about writer's block. But to your point, probably before we get into any of our tips, I think the other big one I would always say with writer's block is like everybody has it, and so everyone has their own little tips. So like if you have any techniques, post them away in the chat. People can use them. There's just so many things that people have gone through that they're just like, this worked for me, this didn't, that could work for you as well. One of the ways to get through writer's block, of course, is the sprint down below. So we're already crushing it here as part of the stream.
Problem solved.
What's one of your tips that you give out to people on writer's block?
Yeah, so generally speaking, my big one is always to just think about that. And I know we talk about this a lot, but think about that audience experience you're trying to create, that reader experience for the person who is going through your story. It's the reason you started writing the story in the first place, right? It's at the very, very heart of everything you're doing. And I think generally speaking, if you refocus in on that, it'll help you figure out what the next steps are you need to get up and over your block. Because the block can come from anywhere, right? It can come from events in the world that are happening. It can come from too many messages popping up. It could be a pet going nuts. It can be a child going nuts. It can be literally anything. Lack of caffeine, too much caffeine, so on and so forth. So when you do get blocked, go back to that experience you're trying to create and really zoom in real tight on that, I think. Because basically, one way to think about your story in a lot of ways is, and please don't ever literally do this, but it's a useful metaphor. It's a bunch of extension cords that are all plugged into each other. And the problem is, if any of those extension cords aren't plugged in fully, you can lose power to the whole thing. And I find like with writer's block, that's often what happens. One of those connections just isn't strong. And as a result, we're writing and everything seems like it's flowing really well. And then suddenly we're just out of juice because something went wrong. So consider that experience you're trying to create. Think about the elements that need to be present for that experience to exist. And then go back and check all those connections.
Yeah,
check,
it's like old Christmas tree lights, right? Just one bulb
exactly
goes
like
out.
old Christmas tree lights. Yeah, all it takes is one, and then suddenly the entire system is broken. Similarly, you can imagine it as dominoes, where one of the dominoes is missing. So when you go to flick the amazing thing you've set up, they just go halfway and stop, and you're like, oh, that's not nearly as impressive.
Those are really disappointing whenever that happens.
Yeah, particularly given how much time it is to reset it. So
dominoes not falling is one of those real disappointing things.
Just do it with like mental dominoes. But yeah, so what is your story? What story are you actually trying to tell? Who's it about? Think about your characters a bit. Think about what their wants and needs are. And then if all else fails, the big one for me is reverse engineer your ending. Just go, okay, well, this is where I know everyone ends up, if you know your ending. Generally speaking, for me, that's the thing I usually know first, and then I kind of work back. So if you're going to get there, what are just some of the steps that need to happen? Not necessarily all of them, but if I know that the climax is a shootout on a boat, I'm aware they need to get to a boat. Well, how do they get to the boat? Okay, well, maybe it's this. Okay, well, why would they be going to the boat in the first place? Oh, well, because like the crime boss is on the boat. Oh, how do they figure that out? You can basically just start working your way back, and eventually you'll find that spot where you broke up. That's it. We're getting some great ones in the chat. We got some things writing on
stuff.
Sorry?
A lot of brain cleaning stuff. A lot of doing mundane tasks. Yeah.
Totally, which I want to get to in a minute. But Nick, I also want to hear yours. But before we get to that, let's just handle some of the ones in the chat. Writing on something else. Ray Bradbury had this, whose output was completely prolific.
There it is.
Speaking of distraction.
Go, dog, go.
Sorry, she's more of an Asimov fan. She gets real mad when I mention Bradbury. Ripley, hey, pup, that's enough. That's enough.
I'm going to take Ripley's side on this one. Asimov rules.
Yeah, I mean, Asimov's great, but Bradbury's whole thing was part of the reason he was had such prolific output was whenever he got blocked, he would just switch to a different thing. So there's this great interview with him where he's like, oh yeah, well, I start by writing a book. And then when I run out of juice on the book, I start a short story. And when Ripley, hey, come on, pup, that's enough. Run out of juice on the short story, switch to a poem. Run out of juice on the poem, switch to an essay. Run out of juice on the essay, switch to a screenplay. And by then, I'm so desperate to get back to my novel that it feels great. So absolutely agree. Great way to do it. Um, Doing mundane tasks. I have a friend who works on the Canadarm. He's an engineer, and he calls problems shower-based problems. So he's like, this is a 3-shower problem. I'm going to have 3 showers before I can solve this. And I love that theory. So yeah, absolutely. Breaking it up a little bit, stepping away from your computer. That's part of the reason sprints are so good, because they just kind of, even if you get nothing done, it's giving your brain room. And part of the reason we talk during them is to give you something else to jump to. But yeah, going for a walk, anything that can break you up and out. I play Beat Saber, if that's an option for you. Just anything that breaks you out of your routine. Nick, what are you feeling, bud?
What's I mean, like this whole thing is like a meta experience for me, because I got a lot of my best writing done while attending like university lectures, sitting in classes, anything. And now I found I actually like intentionally will turn on white noise generators or turn on lectures on like not a boring subject, but just like something I know really well already anyways. So I don't care a ton about hearing it. And for some reason that really works for me. So I'm hopeful that us just like droning on about this and hearing some voices in the background talking about something that you kind of are familiar with helps people while they write. So that was certainly one of the things that I did or do now, is kind of produce white noise. I do also do the Bradbury trick. I write just different stories at once. I have multiple different stories going at once, and I will just kind of cycle between them as I get if I get stuck or bored with one, especially when when you wake up and you're just like, I don't want to write a fantasy today. Like, I just want to write, or it's like this story's gotten too serious, too dark. I just want to write something like fun and fluffy today. Why can't I do that? And so I have a fun and fluffy story. So I just write more of that story. And then there's times where I'm like, I can't just write comedy all the time. I gotta write something more serious and self-important. And then I go back to the other one. So I usually have a handful of stories going on at once. And it gets frustrating for people because they, instead of waiting for just one story to be finished, they have to wait 3 times as long for like 3 stories to finish all at once. Not the best. The biggest breakthrough for me, though, that always helped me in my earlier days was when I switched to significantly smaller goals and was just like, I just need to get this one chapter done. And I originally started with, I just need to get this one story done. I just need to finish a story. And I made it, I'm going to say like 1,000 words. It was not a very long story. And then I moved to like, okay, I'm going to make a slightly longer story finished. And then it was like 5,000 words. And just finishing a story felt really great. And then I converted it into just like, okay, well, I can write 1,000 to 5,000 words. Let me just write a chapter. And every time I would just write a chapter, I'm like, all I need to do is just get out a chapter. I'm not thinking about writing the end of the book or the whole book. I'm definitely not thinking about series. This is why I always recommend to people, like, don't tell me it's a 5-book series when you're just starting the first book. Like, write the first book, see how you feel at the end of, because you might write that first book, and even though there's more story to tell, be like, I need to back off for a year or two. So maybe don't promise people that there's going to be 8 extra books coming before they've even gotten there. You might want to just take a break at the end of it. So small goals definitely help me out. Switching contexts help me out. If all else fails, I do a lot of the stuff that Chad is recommending over here, which is I find if you get too sucked into like creative endeavors and force yourself to think about it for too long, it doesn't work. So I instead just like go on a walk for an hour and do straight up nothing. Or go into the shower. Clean dishes is a great one. Vacuuming, all of that sort of cleaning stuff.
Yeah, there's a book that a lot of actors are forced to read at some point in their lives that is both incredibly useful and incredibly useless depending on your outlook and your perspective. But it's called The Artist's Way. And one of the things it recommends is to take yourself on a creative date, which it can be something like going to a museum, going to a gallery, something outside of your sphere of the craft of acting, but just something to help kind of like spark your imagination a little bit. And I would say for us as writers, to your point, Nick, about kind of doing something else, one of the best ways I found to do that is to just find something that feeds you creatively. I'm hearing music here, which I'm like you, Nick. I put on, something I've seen a bunch. So, like The Simpsons is great for me. There's certain movies that are great just in the background because I grew up. The only way I could justify watching as much Simpsons as I wanted to as a kid was because it was on like 5 times a day in Canada, which was a delight. But I had to justify that I could do my homework while watching it, so I learned to just kind of split my focus between the two. So all that stuff helps me. But I mean, I find even one of my side hustles is I run a Muppet Shakespeare company, which I'll unpack at a later date, I'm sure. But there's a very specific tone to writing in that style. And so watching something with a similar tone, weirdly, the Marvel movies are good for that. Rat Race was fantastic for it. But finding something that just kind of refills my tank as I'm going, I find very, very helpful. And sometimes that means just stepping away from the writing and just watching something or reading something or playing a video game, something that just kind of recharges my batteries creatively. And it's funny because it seems like a waste of time on the surface. Like, playing a video, particularly video games, because there's been such a traditional stigma about them being a time suck. Which, if you look at how many hours, a lot of games are like, you've been playing for this many hours. I'm like, don't tell me how many days of my life are sunk into ancient Greece, you monsters. But I'm using that time to let my brain rest a little bit, to recharge, and to find. I often find a lot of really good story solutions while playing games. Not that the game itself has given me that, but that tying up part of my brain so the rest of my brain can just mull it over. And I would say the same thing with dishes. Dishes are great for that. Dog walks are great for that. Showers are great for that. So yeah, find those things that charge your batteries, and don't be ashamed of pausing your own creative endeavor to absorb energy from someone else's, because that can actually really help you. And it feels rough to step away from the keyboard and to stop. But if you consider I think the worst parts about writer's block is often we completely vapor lock our brains. We're just so focused on, I have to get over this, that you actually can't. Because your brain is more worried about, can I get over the writer's block, than actually solving the problems that have caused the writer's block. So anything you can do to just kind of unplug, de-stress, and not have writer's block with a capital W and B kind of directly in your eye line is going to do you a world of good.
Yeah, and I had even forgotten one here that Ren mentioned. I do a similar thing, which isn't retyping what I wrote, but I will reread what I wrote. I find that really helps me, because as I reread it, I think about like stuff that I left in there. And I'm just like, right, I have to resolve that plot line. Or even by the time I get to the point where it's done, I'm just like, I want to find out what happens next, so I have to write it. And that reminds me why I started all of this. And also, speaking of starting things, it is the end of the sprint.
Oh, hey, you did it. You did it, writers. You reached the end of the first sprint of the day. Congratulations. Please throw your word counts up if you got them. And if you feel comfortable sharing. If you don't, that's totally fine too. If you just stared at a blank page for 15 minutes because you are currently experiencing writer's block, that's also totally fine. I'm going to say this every damn time we do this. But just taking the time to think about your writing is writing time. So just by being here, you're already committing to your craft and committing to getting it done. So congratulations.
All time is writing time.
Now take a break. Take like a 5-minute break. I don't know.
Set the timer. 5 minutes.
Get like some tea or some coffee, or like go for a walk, or just listen to our dulcet tones. It's completely up to you. I trust you to do the right thing. You got this.
We are
so yeah,
people, so that's fair.
Nick, to your point about reading your stuff, though, I fully agree, and that's kind of what I mean about going back to that reader experience. Because as writers, we can often get bogged down in like, I don't know if I'm conveying this idea I'm working on properly, blah 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 blah. But when you go back and reread your stuff as a reader, suddenly you're experiencing it through their lens. And from the way you're describing it, Nick, you get to that point where you're like, oh yeah, I want to know what happens next, as opposed to as a writer being like, well, I know what happens next. I'm having a hell of a time with it. Right. It's nice to click back into it and be like, oh yeah, cool. This is what's exciting about the story. This is what people are going to be interested in the story, and just allowing yourself to enjoy that. I mean, for me, I find I usually need to sleep on it. I'll usually hack out a bunch of stuff because I'm like kind of a manic late night writer. So I'll just like hack out a bunch of garbage. And by the time we go to bed, I'm like, this is trash. I have no idea if this is good. I'm probably going to delete it. And then the next morning when I wake up and I reread it, I'm like, oh no, this was really great. Oh, I should have kept writing. I was on such a roll. It's a horrible cycle. But yeah, a little bit of distance is great. Yeah, 286 is excellent. You listen to two people jaw on, and you're on the road. Harder to write while driving, so stay safe. But
don't write and drive, people.
Yeah. Unless you're in a fancy self-driving car, but even then, like, maybe keep an eye out because they're not really there yet.
No, they're not. You can't not drive while in one of those.
So one thing that's always also worth considering around writer's block is if all of these kind of tactics, it basically, there's sort of two ways of thinking about it. One is, yeah, you can like take a step back and walk away for a bit and That's great. I'm full proponent of that. I think that's probably the best solution. But there's also times when you can't, when you're still stuck there looking at your stupid blinking cursor, just taunting you mercilessly with the lack of text. So what do you do if you can't take a break, or if you don't want to? You're on a roll and you just hit one of those road bumps, and you're just like, I gotta power through this, or you're on deadline, or what have you. So as I was mentioning with the extension cord piece, one of the things to start doing then is to really zero in on what's going on in your story, and specifically trying to self triage around the actual thing that's caused your writer's block. Ultimately, when you send me an Oracle ticket, that's what me and the content dev team look at. Part of our job is to kind of sit there and look at the issue you're describing and try and kind of break it down to its elements and figure out elementally how like what's gone wrong and why. It's harder to do it yourself because you're in the middle of it, but it is something you absolutely can do if you can kind of train your brain up to do it. So generally speaking, when you bump up, and Nick, are we back on for writing or not yet?
Not yet.
Great. All right, cool. So when you start breaking that down, when you hit writer's block, a few things to consider. First of all, just actually like check your kind of physical surroundings in yourself. Are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Do you need to use the bathroom? Could you use a stretch? Our bodies are incredible machines, but if you're like me, like I live a lot in my brain and not a lot in my body, and as a result, sometimes my body's like, "Hey, dummy, I know you love the feeling of 4 cups of coffee. Could you drink a water though, please?" And I'm like, "We'll see." But often that can be a huge impact that we just don't think of because we're so busy creating worlds in our head that we're ignoring the biological engine and imperative that needs some attention. So check that, particularly with how much screen time we're doing right now. Like, yikes. So think about that. In terms of your actual story itself, looking at the issue, there's a few ways to do it. First, consider where you are in your story. What's going on around you? Is the block where you've just come from, i.e., I had my characters break up spectacularly, hugely dramatic, so engaging, so juicy, but I may have broken it, which happens all the time, right? We come up with awesome twists or awesome sequences that often surprise us as writers, and then we have to deal with our own mess, and sometimes we actually can't. So part of what got you there might just be that what you just wrote, even though it's really, really good, broke the thing that you're trying to eventually get to. Problem might be where to go next. I'm really excited about everything that's happened to this point, but there we go.
There it is.
Writing
I'll start the sprint again.
Start typing. Type so fast. Just Jim Carrey and Bruce Almighty that. Just pound that keyboard with your fingers like you're the Kermit meme. Just gonna keep cycling through pop culture references of people typing.
Good reference.
Or I don't know, redip your quill pens. I don't know how you write, but I respect that you're doing it. Consider where you're going. So you might just run out of juice on like, okay, well, all I really knew was that they were going to, escape from the villain. I don't know how they get to the next piece at all. Are the characters themselves the problem? I know often in tickets, people are like, I just feel like my characters aren't working. It's time to interrogate what not working means. What are the pieces? Like what specifically is feeling off to you about what's going on? All of these are little clues you can start to look for that will help guide you kind of, again, if we're using our stupid extension cord metaphor, back along your extension cord to find out where the actual issue is. Mm-hmm. Failing all of that, you can submit an Oracle ticket if you're amongst the stars. And if not, you can talk to us here.
You can talk to us.
Yeah, ask a friend. Yeah. Throw it in the chat. Sometimes it's as simple as I find, honestly, as a writing coach, most of the writers I talk to solve their own problems just by speaking out loud. Yes. So asking a friend doesn't necessarily mean, oh, I expect my friend who isn't a writer to solve this problem for me. It's just giving your brain space to actually unpack it. And honestly, having an outside eye sometimes is all you need. Seeing some comments in the chat here that I fully agree with. Kill your darlings is a term that gets thrown around a lot in writing. What that means is that, and if you've ever had to edit your own work, you'll know exactly what this means. But it refers to the idea that you will write very good things that do not make it to the page or to the final draft. This is true of film. So much stuff gets cut out of film, but it's also true of books. And sometimes you may have written the best scene you've ever written, and it just does not fit your book. Maybe it comes later, maybe it goes earlier, but maybe it just doesn't work. And it sucks. It's a terrible feeling. But it's also understanding as writers, again, ultimately, we're trying to serve our reader. We're trying to create the best possible experience for our reader. And even though I, as writer Tom McGee, might think this is the best thing I've ever written and be in love with it, if it doesn't actually serve that purpose, then it's got to go. And as tough as that is, sometimes that can unblock you. See if there's ideas that you're holding on to about what you thought the story was going to be that are no longer true. I've seen this. I was literally just talking to a playwright about this 2 days ago, where they just had this idea in their head about like, this is the thing I'm doing. But then once they had actors working on it and they were getting it up and running, they actually realized the script meant something different now. It had evolved and was much better for it. But they were still clutching onto these ideas they came in with as the writer, and it was time to let those go. So you may find that about your story too. You may have assumed that one character is an irredeemable jackass, only to discover, actually, no, the readers love them and they have a heart of gold. Maybe I need to find something good for them. Or you might be like, no, they're just awful. That's their purpose, and leave them as that. That's also totally fine. But it's always worth examining what are the elements that are here in the block. Look at all of them, because then you can start to determine which ones aren't working. And sometimes it does mean kind of questioning yourself about that experience and that arc you're creating. And sometimes it'll mean taking out stuff you love, or rethinking, if you've been describing the book to yourself as a certain thing for a long time, you might realize actually it's kind of something different, but that other thing is also kind of beautiful and new. I've been John for a bit. Nick, what are you thinking? What are your thoughts on kind of if you can't walk away, you need to solve for block?
I mean, like what you described is kind of the most common reason that I end up in a block, is a case where I've done something or made an action in the story that puts me in a spot where I realize, like, shoot, I don't know where it goes from here now, and I have to put on a different hat and go back through and start picking apart like how I got here and start understanding it. Why I recommend, especially talking to a friend, and that friend does not have to be an editor, doesn't have to be like good at any of this sort of analysis. What you'll see is most people in a very natural state, they've heard so many stories in their life that they kind of have a sense for when a story just feels wrong. They can't tell you like why specifically it went wrong, or they can't use any of the terminology, they can't pinpoint it, but they can just kind of say things like, oh, that doesn't seem like it can go anywhere, or like, I guess this is what would have to happen next, right? And that can be all it really takes for you, is to just confer with someone, even if they know nothing about like the intellectual components or the academic components of writing. If they're just like, yeah, that sounds kind of interesting, but like, where is it going after this, can be super useful to bounce things back and forth with them. I've also, similarly to the Killing Your Darlings, I think this has been the biggest piece that I've come up against when I've evaluated other people's summaries that they would give me. So I ran a summary workshop for a long time, and the intention there was just to hear, like, what does someone think their story is going to contain? And when you lay it out like that in that summary format, especially when you put a cap on it, like, okay, I put hard caps, like, it has to be 500 words. You can't tell me in more than 500 words. And people would go over those limits because they had to explain other things away. They didn't know exactly what was going to happen here or there. You could really tell where pieces of the story were weak and they weren't sure what was going on. But you could then tell when I would ask questions like, why are you doing that? Why do the characters do this? Or like, why does this happen? Or what's the connection between these two things? I'd get a lot of like, well, no, but they have to do that because it's this kind of story. And I'd have to just ask, like, but is it that kind of story? Like, everything there's a lot of, to quote that someone put in here about, like, if you have a problem in the third act, it's a problem with the first act. This happened a lot where I would basically say, like, okay, your third act has no relationship with your first act. This is a really common, like, this is often why I find people are blocked in their writing, is because they've done something that has now led to, they have to do some other thing, and they didn't do that thing. They choose to do a different thing because they wanted to do it that way. They wanted to write that scene. To use your breakup, they're just like, I want them to break up because it's such a good twist and it'll be really interesting and like devastating to the readers. But the characters don't actually have really good motivations to break up. You didn't set up the scenes before that, so they shouldn't really be breaking up. And then you're stuck because you're like, now they broke up, but I don't know what to do because I didn't give them a reason to break up, right? If the reason for breaking up was because they had realized they were starting to drift apart over the course of a bunch of dates, then they should break up. This is often where you see people retconning in, I assume in the editing process, when they look at that, instead of saying, okay, maybe they shouldn't break up and kill their darling. They instead say, all right, I have to give them a reason. And you get those situations where they go back and they're like, he saw her with another guy, so he thinks that she's cheating on him. There, like it's melodramatic, it's nonsense, it's unearned, and they just chuck it in there, and they're like, yeah, but now they can break up. That's a reason they can break up. See, and we keep the story moving. That's how we keep the story moving. When often the real answer is, if you didn't build up to that point, if you didn't do the thing that was supposed to happen, you'll find yourself stuck. This is why we talked about in the last time. Cliches are good in that way. This is why I said meta cliches are really good, right? Once you make certain choices, there are only so many outcomes. Like the character can only do so many things, and that's not. Twists are more interesting because they were a possibility. You just hadn't noticed it, not because they were. You couldn't have guessed it, right? You couldn't have ever seen that twist coming.
And a properly made twist, and we probably should do a whole one of these just on twists, but a properly constructed twist is still enjoyable if you know the twist. And this is something I think a lot of people like. I'm very spoiler adverse, and I think a lot of us are with TV and movies, and particularly coming from nerd culture. Like I don't want spoilers for all the nerd stuff I want to consume. But by the same token, there are a lot of things that are completely ruined by knowing the twist. And that generally means that the story that was constructed around the twist wasn't actually that good. It means the twist was good, but the story wasn't. Because in theory, if you know the twist and you don't get to have the experience of it, you should still get to enjoy watching it get built. It's the argument behind like an effective prequel tells a story that we theoretically already know the ending of in a really engaging way. So we're like, well, I know where this goes, but I'm just really enjoying watching how we get there.
And people try in prequels because they think that you have to do something special to inject some twist, but then that blows up the already existing canon where it's like, but if they knew them then, why would they have gone through the whole, like,
I'm just going to skip 3 steps and say R2-D2 and C-3PO. Like, come on, guys. They were just robots. Right. It's fine. Right. But yeah, absolutely. Like, we have to do something else, or we have to... I find the worst sort of prequel type, and this is again a separate conversation, but the worst kind of prequel stuff coming in with like, yeah, like we got to change everything you thought you knew. Also, we got to like make everything significant, and we have to call in everything from the next story. And it's like, but that generally means you're not telling a story. You're just putting together kind of a weird clip show of like, look at this thing. This will be important in the next one. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I saw the next one. Can you just tell me a cool story here? Again, I could go on. But
well, in the similar, remember when they offhand mentioned this in the book that you love? I'm going to make it a whole 3-chapter segment, even though no one really cared about that offhand. They just thought it was a cool offhand mention, but I'm going to make sure. And you do get the clip show experience. But this is all of this to say, you get blocked usually when you make these wrong choices along the way, and you fearing that people will. That is another part, right? Even in the whole world of twists. I think something that I see from a lot of our writers on Wattpad is like a fear that the writer will figure out, or the reader, will figure out what's coming. And they don't want that. Or as soon as the reader has figured out that the two characters are going to fall in love, then the writer suddenly feels like they failed. They're like, no, it's supposed to be a surprise when they get there. That's not how it works at all. That is not why people read content. To use the Marvel movies, because those are the ones where people are always like, no spoilers, I don't want to hear anything. The biggest fans of those movies are the people who are already into the comics that the movies are based on, so they already know what happens. Like when these big reveals happen and so-and-so turns out to be the new whatever, and people who have no idea about the comics, they'll be like, oh, wow, that was interesting. People who already knew that was coming, they're so excited to see it happen. They're just like, yes, oh my God, yeah, I finally got to see it happen. They showed me so-and-so doing X. I've always wanted to see that on screen. I've always loved that moment. I always want to relive it. Those are, the choices that you make with your characters and your story. They have to play out. They have to go to that inevitable consequence. So you may want to check on your writer's block and look back and say, like, did I make a weird choice? Have I forced anything? Yeah. Have I done anything that feels a little off? And that's why when you check with a friend, they might say, like, I feel it's kind of off. They won't be able to pinpoint it, but they'll just know, like, that doesn't seem right.
I'll also say for the audience and the reader catching something that you're doing, I talked to a lot of writers about this, and there's this fear of like, oh, well, if they get the twist before the twist hits, then I haven't done my job correctly. And I don't think that's true. There is this old there's a fascinating sort of philosophy around the way Arthur Conan Doyle wrote Sherlock Holmes, which you may know. I found out about when I was studying mystery, and it kind of blew my mind. But the idea is that like Holmes is smarter than all of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Holmes is a mystical super god who can do whatever he wants, and we can't stop it. Watson is telling the story, so any details that will make Holmes seem like a super genius. That we might figure out the twist from are omitted because Watson is the one telling us the story and he just didn't notice. But the catch is that Watson is dumber than we are by like 2 degrees. So the idea is that when we get to the big reveal, and if you look at any Conan Doyle Holmes story, they all play out this way, where like at the end of the book, Holmes sits Watson down and Watson's like, well, Holmes, how did it happen? And Holmes is like, well, let me tell you. And Holmes goes through his whole thing. Now, that description that Holmes gives us often includes details that we as a reader didn't get because Watson didn't notice and tell us. Mm-hmm. But when Holmes gives us those details, we generally solve the mystery. He lays it all out and we go, oh, okay. So like this meant this. Oh, okay. It was this person. All right, I get it. And then Watson says, but Holmes, I don't understand. And we as the reader are suddenly on Sherlock Holmes's team. Because we're like, Watson, you dummy, it's this, obviously. So what he's doing is just tricking our reader expectation to be like, we need Holmes to figure it out, not us, because that's the magic trick of a Holmes story. But then we need to figure it out before Watson, so we feel superior to someone. Right. That feeling of superiority and of solving the puzzle is a legitimate joy. I'm sure you've experienced it from something. And it's a joy that we feel throughout our entire lives. When the people who made Blue's Clues created that show, a lot of them were Sesame Street writers, and their thing was like, we're going to show the same episode of TV every day for 5 days. Because as a kid, you don't have anything. You don't like, you're constantly asking questions. You don't know anything. Whereas we get a lot of like joy from like watching our favorite show or listening to our favorite song or reading our favorite book. As kids, you just don't really have that. So they're like, we're going to turn every episode of Blue's Clues into a kid's favorite show. Because they're not going to understand what's going on in the first episode. By the second episode, they're going to kind of remember some of the solutions. By the third episode, they've got a pretty good handle on it. By the fourth episode, they're guessing the answers to everything because they remember it. By the fifth episode, it's the best thing they've ever seen. Yeah. It's a thing that we love as readers. So don't be afraid to let your readers have that joy. Because sometimes I've seen people hit writer's block because like, oh, like I don't want people to know that of the love triangle, so-and-so is going to end up with so-and-so. And it's like, there's a joy to that. You can root for that. You can be excited about it. And yes, you will 100% get smug readers being like, I knew that was going to happen. But keep in mind, behind that scoffing, like, I knew that was going to happen, is that little spark of joy that we get when we're like talking down to Dr. Watson or watching Blue's Clues as children. It's that beat of like, I got it. I saw the strings. I saw where the story was going. And I managed to figure out what was going to happen, which is really damn cool. And yeah, as Crystal and Felicity say, if you put all the pieces down, the reader can figure it out if they're paying attention, and that's fine. They should be able to, because it's also frustrating by equal parts. If you remove Dr. Watson from the Sherlock Holmes equation, we get to the end of the book, and some smug guy's like, well, here's all the things you missed. And we're like, yeah, because you didn't tell us. Thanks. I feel great. What a great mystery. So yeah, let your readers discover the twist. Let them find it. There's a joy to that. And yeah, that's my little tirade on Blue's Clues and Sherlock Holmes, which is I'm sure what you signed up for here today. We've got some stuff in the chat.
Sprint ended, so congrats.
Oh hey, congratulations everybody. Give me those sweet word counts when you can. Take 5 minutes to not be writing. That's nice. That's always a nice break. Yeah. We've got some fun stuff in the chat. I just want to loop back around to. Yvonne pointed out earlier something that I fully agree with, which is during the process of killing your darlings, I'd recommend setting up just like a slush pile. We have now that I'm still surrounded by notebooks, as you can see from the background. But in the age of digital writing, it's so easy to just open a Word doc or a Google Doc and just dump all the sections you're cutting in there. You may find use for them later. In some cases, they become their own stories. So if you're really proud of it, it's not that it has to disappear from existence from space and time. It just might not need to be in your story. But yeah, absolutely hang on to those. The playwright I work with primarily, she's written two plays off of cut lines and cut concepts that she was still really interested in, and she just like spun out into their own things. So you never know when you're going to need those or use them. And it might even just be a different story you're writing where you're like, oh, wait a minute, that awesome scene I had in this other thing could be repurposed to work here. So yeah, keep your stuff. It's gold. Again, we no longer order ink by the gallon. Like you can you can just throw it in a digital space and it'll just kind of live there magically until you upload too many RPG character sheets like I do and get yelled at by Google. So definitely hang on to those. Synopsis is also good, again, largely because it just forces you to look at what your story actually is.
Really
what's your story about?
It and forces
There's the writer director of, I think it's the Red Violin, used to take people out to dinner and like very intimately tell them the whole story of his movie, and everyone he talked to felt very much like they were being let in on a secret. And then like, I don't know, it's the guy's agent or something who was like, no man, he's been doing that all over town, because that's how he's honing the idea for the film, by telling people the story over and over and over again. He's watching their reactions and just the summary of what this movie is going to be, and just tweaking it. So super, super useful. Okay, so you mentioned of Dark Night of the Soul in romance being the bane of your existence. Yeah, there will always be tropes and sequences that are hard for us. I've talked about this before, but like, actually, it's that roughly that section for me as well is always like a rough spot. The middle part's always rough. Again, best thing to do is look at it and say, do I actually need this? Does my story benefit from this? It's a time-tested trope, and I know a lot of structural books are like, it must be there. As with all rules, most of the time, absolutely. But if you're forcing it in just because a book told you to, that's probably not the best reason for it to be there. To Nick's point, is this actually what your characters need? To the point of the breakup piece, so many romances, particularly on Wattpad, have an artificial breakup inserted because it's just an expected piece. And it always feels weird. As a reader, you feel mad, but not in a good way. There's a good way to feel mad about a breakup, which is, I'm really rooting for these two characters, or however many characters are involved in the relationship. I'm really rooting for them to make it work. Mm-hmm. And if the breakup comes naturally, as Nick was suggesting, from the things you've kind of laid along the way, then, it's going to hurt so good. I'm going to be like, oh no, like she really should have told her about, the fact that she still occasionally sleeps with her ex. That would have been good knowledge for them, and we knew this time bomb was going to go off.
I mean, that feels like a pretty...
And it did. No, but it did. Like, yeah, but we're like, we saw, it's the classic Greek tragedy thing, right? We saw all the pieces, the dominoes were all there, and then when they fall, we feel bad, but we're also aware of why, as opposed to the artificial breakup where we're like, like, I don't like that they broke up, and also there doesn't seem to be any reason why they would, other than this thing that often doesn't really feel true to either of the characters.
Get back together. They have to, because it's like they didn't have a reason to break up, so now they have no reason not to get back together. They're just going to get back together.
And I would say we also see this a lot in romances where the characters don't have anything other than the relationship. If the entire character, if the lover and the beloved are the only things in the world, it's kind of hard to figure out what to do with them if they aren't actively pursuing each other, because they have no interests or goals outside of this. So that might be a problem too. And you may find this if you go, actually my characters are just the genre or the central conceit. So in a romance, my characters are just lovers. They actually don't have anything else going on. In an action story, it would often be stakes. It's like, if my character doesn't have, because I mean, there's a reason that everyone from Jack Bauer to John McClane to like James Bond might be the exception. Hey, it's writing a clock. Get back to it. You stop having fun listening to us and start typing again. But if the character doesn't have stakes outside of whatever the action scenario is, it's kind of hard to care. But the minute it's like, and my child is in danger, it's like, okay, great. We've got a really good reason. I mean, like, The Rock is a really hacky example of this, but it opens with like Sean Connery meeting his daughter and being like, I have someone to live for. And Nick Cage being like, my wife's pregnant. I shouldn't go out in the field anymore. Both of them have huge stakes. We never really see those characters again, but it gives us a reason to want them to succeed over and above just stop Ed Harris. Also, like, don't stop Ed Harris. He's such a nice guy. Anyway, so all that to say, yes, one of the reasons you might be blocked is you're trying to force a trope in that shouldn't be there, because most of the time it is. See if you really need it or not. And we'll talk more about Dark Night of the Soul, I'm sure, down the road, because that is such a difficult spot to nail. And when you nail it particularly well, it becomes, in a lot of ways, almost more, I think, when I've seen it done incredibly well, that is often the most powerful scene in the story, more so than the climax, because there's all the anticipation and fear and stress, and it can become such an amazing, amazing beat. Or it can just be something getting in the way of a cooler scene that we know is coming. But we'll leave that for another another night.
Yeah.
All right, I think we're all caught up on
We're all caught up. We got it all.
On Ridge Chat. Well, great.
Yeah, and people can continue to throw stuff in there. I think.
Yeah.
I kind of want to shift into. I mean, we have two topics here. One is like getting stuck in the middle, which is as symbolized by the Dark Night of the Soul, which I think, the two ways that I've always solved for that are either I have to reverse engineer, like you talked about. I know how this is going to end, and then I move back from there. And the other thing you have to know is like where you came from. So for me, I'm kind of like, okay, if I started with a character who's shy and a doormat, and they're going to finish being more outgoing and vivacious, then in order to become more outgoing and vivacious, they have to have gone through something that forced them to have to be that way or learn the lesson of not being that way. So, okay, that means they're going to have to do something that involves that. And what I have to do from there is figure out what kind of choices would a character make that would cause that to happen. Again, you can't just be like, okay, you can't just make it like a god shows up and just gives them 3 trials and those 3 trials happen to turn them into whatever you need them to turn into by the end. You instead have to say, like, okay, someone who's shy, who needs to learn to be vivacious, will need to be put into a scenario by which they have to become vivacious in order to succeed. So I'm going to put them in a scenario where they get paired with, through a misunderstanding, the hottest guy in school wants to take them to the dance and thinks that they're like his soulmate because he got his fortune read the other day or something like that. Like there's a pretty wacky thing, and now they're kind of like, okay, but I'm really shy in a doormat, so I'll just go along with it because he says so. And they need to learn, like, they need to have some negative things happen to them that cause them to be like, I want this to go away. The only way I can make it go away is by talking about it. That would be the sort of thing where I reverse engineer, like, okay, this is what has to happen. Or, weirdly, I forward engineer it, and I say, based on the choices I just made them make, what would they do next? Because that's the sort of thing you'll always hear from people when they complain about middles, when they complain about characters, is always like, that's not what they mean when they say that's not realistic. Is just, I don't believe someone would make that choice given what was... People aren't really complaining about, like, I always make this joke with, like, if someone's watching a fantasy series and suddenly they're like, oh, that's not realistic, is always be like, yes, it was the flying eagles of giant proportion that really made it not realistic. You had no problem with the wizards and the dragons and all the other stuff, but sure, that's the bridge that's too far. That's not usually what they mean when they're saying it's not realistic. What they mean is like, I can't really realistically see someone making that choice. I can't see them doing that thing. Why would they have done what they just did there? That makes no sense, right? To your The Rock example, if they have no like kid that's worth fighting for, they might just be like, and they get called on to go into battle, they might just say like, no thanks, like I don't want
this is hard. I don't want this. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that could totally be a thing. You see that all the time with like some of the chosen one, non-chosen one stories where they're not officially a chosen one, but they're just kind of like, oh, well, they have to stop it. And I had to ask this all the time in summaries, like, but why did they have to stop it? They have no particular reason to, just because they're like a good person. They have none of the choices they made are specific to them, have any relationship to this story. You've just like put a character in a scenario basically, rather than building a scenario around said character or playing it out according to said character. So that's usually where I find people get stuck on middles.
And to your point about the unrealistic piece, it can also be that you've broken the rules that you've established for your world. Now, this obviously applies more to, in broader terms, to fantasy and sci-fi.
It can apply to. I can definitely see it applying to romance. Believe me.
Oh no, it absolutely
like
does.
The rules of relationships, or the rules of like, okay, you said your character doesn't gossip, so why are they gossiping? Like you established a rule.
Exactly. Those are the sorts of things, like it's usually more obvious in like a fantastical scenario, because I mean, using the Harry Potter films as an example, where you had different directors bringing drastically different methodologies of presenting that story. We go from, well, if you're going to use a wand, you have to say the words and point. It's real specific, to like, screw it, we're just going to laser duel, which admittedly looks amazing on film. But I know for a lot of longtime fans of the series, they're like, well, hang on a second. And it's that, well, hang on a second instinct, whether it's my character doesn't gossip, now they're gossiping, my character doesn't drink, now they're drunk at a party, my character believes in, fidelity above all things, and suddenly is having an affair. Like when you break those rules, that's generally when an audience is like, it isn't realistic. They aren't necessarily talking about the actual fabric of reality. That's the way they're phrasing it. But it's really about, no, you introduced, it's the same thing we were talking about last week with dream sequences. Like you introduced a set of rules in a world for me and that's where we're playing. And when you break that, unless there's a really good reason or there's justification or what have you, then it just feels off. You're like, oh no, hang on, no, we'd all kind of loosely agreed to what we were, the realm we were playing in. The Game of Thrones example that always comes to mind is in the show, everyone's like, wait a minute, suddenly they can travel real fast. And from a narrative standpoint, thank you. Let's just get it done. I don't need a full season of someone on a boat. Problem is, you already gave me a full season of someone on a boat. So now we're like, that's the time frame. So
and you established that it was important.
And there's plenty, exactly. There's plenty of reasons to change things, but that's kind of, to my mind, where readers start getting hung up on it. And as a writer, that might be where you're hung up as well. Is going like, well, based on the rules that I like, it's the painting yourself into a corner situation. Based on the rules I have given my characters. I mean, the clearest example for me on this is like if you're dealing with sort of a werewolf or a vampire or something with a heavy mythology and rules around it, you can get real stuck where it's like, oh no, okay, well, I've established they can't do XYZ thing. I need them to do XYZ thing, but right, because of the rules I established, I can't, which might mean go back and fix it. To Nick's earlier point, go back and fix those rules so that you can do the thing you need to do, or come up with a really exciting way out. One of the most climactic moments of Breaking Bad involved the main characters being trapped in their RV, surrounded by the feds, and the writers didn't actually know how to get them out of it. So they sat down and they put up a whiteboard and they came up with all these different schemes for how they could get out of the situation. And in the show, one of the characters lists all the ideas they didn't use that could have just been the back end of the episode. And then eventually they settled on one and went with that. But that's a legitimate way to try and solve an issue you're working on, is literally just come up with a bunch of hypotheticals, look at them, decide which one you want to use, and move ahead with that. Yep. It's okay to not know how to get out of it. But in that case, they were like, well, we have established rules. So the best way out of it for us is if we can come up with a solution that still respects those rules. And they did, rather than, well, we'll just rewrite our rules to give them a note. So anyway, yeah, stuff to consider.
You can, even if you go that far into the corner, sometimes it's worth, and this is a huge, like, kill your darlings kind of thing. Sometimes it's worth just seeing where that corner goes, being like, okay, I wrote them into a scenario where they can only get arrested. And I never planned for that to happen, but like, let's just see what happens if they let's let them get arrested. Like, what is the next stages that happen after this, and like, where else can it go, and kind of play that out. But I think the other one that came up in the chat was just like killing, eventually reaching a point where you say like, I have to kill this story, it can't go any further. You know, this is where I draw the line. It's something I've done with a lot of my stories, and then later I've often amalgamated all those dead pieces into a new story. I'm like, now I found where they belong, or brought them into my current writing. I think I'm curious on your side, like, most interesting or worst thing that you've like killed, that you've just been like, you know what, I hit the wall, and when you knew, you're just like, it goes no further than this, it's over.
Wow, that's a very good question.
And then chat obviously can throw some of theirs.
Oh yeah, all right. So this is a playwriting example. I will fully cop to the fact that I've written more plays than I have books, so forgive me for an adjacent writing story. But with my Muppet Shakespeare Company, I've got two. With my Muppet Shakespeare Company, I wrote a production of Hamlet, where everybody died, and that was great. And I was bound and determined to put Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead in here. So if you're unfamiliar, Tom Stoppard, American playwright, wrote a play called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. British playwright, American player. That is essentially The Lion King 1.5, if you've seen that. It's like a story that takes place during Hamlet, but that's a weird existential absurdist look at two side characters and kind of their trials and tribulations. There's a good movie of it if you're interested. But I wanted to, because I'm a theater nerd, I wanted to include that in this puppet Hamlet somewhere. And it was a small scene. It was like not very long at all. And there's this whole bit where they're flipping a coin and it's always heads. And they're talking about odds and probability and everything else. So I was bound and determined, because the puppet doing it is this, her name is Donna, and she's this big furry blue monster puppet with human hand, like hands in gloves. So you get a lot of like fun articulate stuff. And all I wanted was to watch this puppet have to flip a big stupid coin. And the other puppet was a trunk with eyes. So it was just a tremendously stupid scene. It was so funny. And I wanted it so badly. And it was adding, I think, conservatively 10 minutes to the runtime of the script. It was so bad. Killed the momentum, made no sense. And one of the goals, of course, with children's theater is clarity. And it was just muddying the waters like crazy. And my actors were like, hey, we know you love this. it's gotta go. And I fought for like 2 days and then finally scrapped it and never looked back. It should have gone. It should not have been in the script. I'm still amused by it, but it was a terrible idea, just absolutely awful. And I did the opposite of the advice we're giving you, which is like to understand that and cut it earlier. I kept it all the way to rehearsal and then had to begrudgingly take my ball and go home. So in that case, it was a scene. I also wrote a full-length play that turned out really well, but after a few series of reads with development reads, basically we realized the script just wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. So I rewrote the whole thing from scratch, completely changed the cast, changed the characters. Basic idea stayed, but I just rebuilt the whole thing, and it worked so much better. But I literally hit a point where I was like, and as we talked about, kept a lot of the stuff and was able to reinsert it into this new story. But it was landing, the message that was coming out of the story was completely, like, it wasn't a message play, but the message that my readers and actors were taking from it was completely wrong. And so as much as it pained me, because I really spent months on this thing, if that was the message they were getting, I'm like, nah, that's not what this is meant to be about. And it's clear to me, but it doesn't really matter if it's clear to me. It's not clear to my readers or viewers. So I gutted it and rebuilt it faster, better, stronger. How about you, Nick? What have you killed of your darlings?
Way back in my earlier days of writing, I wrote probably some 60, 70,000 words worth of fantasy novel. That was just all just cool, Every part of it was just the cool character doing cool things. He just needed to save the world. It had random meaningless prophecies in it in some scenes. It had so many side characters and casts and all over the place. And it was the sort of thing where, like, all of those pieces, and I got really far into it, right? It just kept rolling. Only for me to kind of realize that I just stopped writing it because I was like, it wasn't actually going anywhere. It was just a collection of interesting ideas, but that didn't make it a story. And so that was so much work and time lost. And I feel nothing about it. I'm not like, oh my goodness, I should have. I just killed it and was like, those were interesting stories, and I bet you I could have told something cool in there. And then I followed that up by doing effectively the same thing all over again, thinking I was better than myself and going even further. And writing something that was supposed to be a very weird, like, infinite time loop story where the hero at the end realizes that they were supposed to die and they didn't, and it's them who saved themselves, and so they just end up in this permanent loop. And it was just a commentary, because I thought it was cool. It was just a commentary on like time, right? Kind of to your self-referentiality, where it's like you put Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead in a children's play, where no child's going to get it. Pretty much no adult is going to get it. Maybe only half the English majors who show up who even remember having to do that play, or theater nerds, will be like, oh yeah, right. No, I remember when we had to read that. That's funny. Okay, ha ha ha. It's usually those kind of things where I put my fantasy one died because it was just like full of cool scenes and ideas that I'm like, no, everyone will know this reference in this one. And then my second one died because I was like, it's a really cool meta commentary on, like, time and free will, though. You'll really love it. And I was like, will they? They will not. They will not really love it. No one will really love it, actually. It's a story for me. It's a scene for me, right? As you were saying, like, you found it really funny. It's a scene for me. It's not for them. I've killed a number of those. Oh, and also there goes the end of the sprint. Right there.
Oh, hey, which is really good timing. So congratulations. I hope you got some stuff written if you were sprinting with us. I'm also sometime next week going to put up into our channel just a sprint video. It'll just be me saying encouraging words every 15 minutes, but unlike this, it'll just be the timer, and you can, if you just need something to sprint to during the week, you could just use that. I might even put some, like, public domain music under it. Who knows?
It'll be Tom's white noise generator, basically.
Yeah.
Of promotion and progress.
Yeah, it's just me making affirming noises, like, oh, good idea. Yeah, that's great.
You're really
interesting. Good stuff.
If anyone wants to put in the chat here in these final, 5 minutes, if you want to chuck in, like, the weirdest, worst, or best idea that you had to kill because you were just like, it had to die. It was the way that it was meant to be. Feel free to post it in here. I am shocked that...
Put the dog in.
Put the dog in it. It's true. I mean, I'm shocked.
Ripley can do cameos.
Shocked we made it to the end. Nothing happened. She's still just as asleep as she was when we started. She continues to sleep. Ripley is also asleep, no longer barking. So there you go, everyone. You got free cat and free dog on stream, and I hope that was motivating. And congrats, of course, to Yvonne for 255. Good.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Good work.
And again, reviewing time it never feels like writing time, but it is 100% writing time. So good for you for going back and looking at where you left off.
See, Yvonne, if you're telling me that cats change position, that says to me that you're not paying enough attention to your writing. You're watching my cat instead. Gotta get up. No,
but
totally
could
fine.
be writing about the cat, Nick. You never know. This
That's
could
fair.
be research.
That's fair. Could all be fair research. I thought she was gonna. Briefly, it looked like she was gonna get into a moment where she would get us banned from YouTube because there was gonna be some X-rated content as she cleaned herself.
Yeah. Well, Ripley at one point put her head on the armrest and knocked my mouse, which was not a thing I had realized could happen. So good to know. Doggo has control of the stream.
This is a good thing that I have control.
What do? But all this to say, just to kind of wrap up. Once again, consider your reader, your audience, the experience you want to give them to both Nick and my Kill Your Darling story. If it's something you realize is just for you, that could well be what's blocking you, because your story instinct is saying, you know what, this shouldn't be here. Generally speaking, whenever you get that little gut pull of like, oh, I don't know if this actually needs to be in this, honor that. Take the time to take a look at it and really think about whether you want it, whether your story needs it, or whether it's just something that's.
Next time we're gonna have to cover the opposite of this, which is imposter syndrome and feeling like, oh, no parts of your story are good enough for your story.
Totally, yeah. And someone mentioned earlier, and I did want to loop around this. Maybe we'll do it next week. I think that's probably a good call. But the fear of breaking your story by cutting stuff is very real, and I fully understand that. And also, it's a big part of writer's block. Getting to a point where you're like, it's because it's always a bit of a balancing act, right? You're always on that tightrope of like, oh, my story's going so well, I don't want to screw it up in the ending. I don't want to not stick the landing. Is a huge concern. So yeah, we'll do that. We'll handle that next week along with imposter syndrome and a bunch of other stuff. Yeah, for future us. Who knows?
So many future
maybe we'll be cyborgs by then. But in the meantime, if you're blocked, be kind to yourself. Though, as with anything, turning inward and stressing about it and beating yourself up is going to just slow the process down so much. So it's okay to accept a temporary defeat. Take a walk, have a shower, do some dishes, play a video game, read a book, listen to some music, play an instrument, paint, do some yoga, go for a different walk. I don't know, whatever works for you.
All the many things.
But consider that your writing time as well. Don't feel as though you've failed at writing if you're doing those things to get unstuck. Doing those things is what is going to get you unstuck. It is part of your writing process. And it is worth honoring that all of that and all of the kind of creative contemplation you do and creative consumption you do is part of your process. So on that note, thank you all for joining us. We will talk next week about imposter syndrome, sticking the landing, and all the fears around that. In the meantime, our forum is still open if you want to drop anything in there.
Yeah. Do we have an email yet that people can send to?
We don't have an email yet, but we'll have one next week. That's part of the big future suite. But till then, check out the forum, and we'll keep plugging away. Until then, happy writing. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will see you next time here on StorySights.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.